Welcome, everybody. My name is Chad Ellis, and I work for the Noble Research Institute in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and also chair the board of the National Grazing Land Coalition. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the second installment in a series of 5 webinars in a series focused on soils, forages, and grazing management. And we're really proud to be partnering on this series with NCBA and many other collaborators who are interested in providing the latest compelling information in this arena. As a participant tonight, your line is going to be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen at the end of the presentations. The teams will answer as many questions as time will allow. And if you have trouble with your technology, or if you're joining us only with audio with your cell phone, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available for viewing within 24 hours at ncba.org. So the webinar tonight is going to be focused on forage systems. We've got a great panel. Our speakers are Jerry Doan, the co-owner of the Blackleg Ranch in McKenzie, North Dakota. And Jerry's also a past Environmental Stewardship Award winner. We also have Gene Fults, a Rangeland Management Specialist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service based out of Portland, Oregon. And my good friend Gary Bates, the director of the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. So you can read more about them on the webinar series page at ncba.org. So with that, we won't hold any more, and so I'm going to, Dr. Bates, I'm going to hand it off to you so you can kick off our presentations.
All right, Chad, thank you very much for that, and we appreciate everybody joining in on this. And so we are going to talk about forage systems and trying to find the right fit, for your program. And, one of the things that I think is very important to think about when we start talking about pasture systems, we need to start thinking about, okay, what are the characteristics that we're looking for? And I, just sat down and started typing a few of these different things. And I don't think there's any of us that would disagree with, we want to choose forages that are going to give us a long grazing season, give us a lot of yield. They're going to last a long time. We want them to be pretty easy to establish, pretty easy to manage. And then most of us would say one of the biggest things is we want them to be really cheap. We don't want them to cost a whole lot. And, when it comes time to put a webinar like this together, one of the challenges that we have is that the forages that you choose are really going to depend on where you are in the nation, because we have just such a varied situation when it comes to temperature and rainfall. And if you start looking at how we kind of classify forages, we have grasses, legumes, and underneath each one of those, we have, cool season and warm seasons. And then under each one of those categories, we have annuals and perennials, and there's just a ton of different forage species that we can use. So I think one of the ways that we've decided to break this seminar up tonight is that I'm going to generally cover kind of what we'll call the eastern part of the U.S., the place where we get plenty of rainfall, and talk about how do we choose forage species that really can fit into a program, and what kind of is the process to go through to make good decisions. And one of the things that was interesting is that I read a paper not too long ago, and it was by a researcher named Dr. Matt Sanderson. And what he did was he reviewed literature that had been done over many years, looking at all kinds of different mixtures. And so you can, read what I have here. It's 175 different mixtures in all these different studies. And they range from anywhere between a 2 species and a 7 species mix. And they were done over several years. And what he wanted to try to figure out by just reviewing all this literature was, how many species do you need, and is more better? And I'm not going to go through all of the data, but I'm going to pull one statement that came out of that paper. And it's this highlighted section down here. It says species, identity, and composition of forage mixtures were more important determinants of yield than simply the number of species. So this is going to be the Bates summary of this. What they said in this paper was it wasn't really important how many species you had. It was making sure that you had the right species and the right mixtures. And so that's part of the challenge that we have when it comes time to developing a forage system, is making sure that we choose the right mixtures and not just pile species on top of species, but make sure we have a plan in terms of doing that. So I think some of the most important criteria that we need to think about is first of all, we do need a certain level of forage yield, because we need to be able to, have a certain amount of forage produced to be able to carry our animals. But it's not always just forage yield. There's an aspect where we have to really worry about the yield distribution. We need to get consistent yield over a long period of time so that we can minimize, how much stored feed that we have to provide. But then even with that, we have to do that keeping cost in mind, because we can't just afford to throw money, into a pasture without getting the type of yield and the distribution that we need. So I'm just going to think about in terms of that yield and distribution, because if we do a good job in our forage selection, then it's going to give us good, yield, good top growth. It's also going to give us good root growth, and the things that were covered in the previous seminar with the soil health side, all of those things will follow right behind that, because we're going to have good plant production on that. So the first thing I think that we always need to keep in mind is we need to use some sort of perennial grass as the base of our forage program. Now, if I start thinking about, the U.S., and we focus on this eastern side, which is where I'm going to focus on most of it. If you go through kind of the southern part of the U.S., this Gulf South area, they're going to be primarily based on warm season forage species. So maybe, it's Bermuda grass, maybe it's Bahia grass, Dallas grass, some sort of a warm season species. If you go to kind of the northern portion, that's where they're going to be based primarily on cool season species. So it may be tall fescue or orchard grass or timothy or some of those, good perennial cool season species. And then there's this area kind of in between there. We'll call it kind of that mid-south area. So the Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, right through there. It's kind of a transition zone where you have the opportunity to use both cool season perennials and warm season perennials. So what we're going to kind of do for the rest of the time is let's just talk about kind of what a forage program would be in that kind of that mid-south area. I mean, part of it is because that's where I spend most of my time working, but at least it shows you, it's going to show you the principle that we use in developing a forage program. So if we start thinking about what we use in that mid-south area, tall fescue is our primary forage species that we use. It forms the base of our forages. And one of the reasons that we do this, because it's got a relatively long growing season. It does, it starts growing about this time of the year in the late February to early March period. It does extremely well through the, late May, maybe the middle of June. And then it's going to start to slump because it gets hot, it gets dry. And then when it starts again in September, the temperatures start to come down. We get some fall rains. Our fescue grows again. And it is going to do that until kind of the mid-November period, somewhere in that time. And then it's usually going to go dormant until we start the growth again the following March. And so tall fescue is a fantastic forage. It gives you really good forage production. You can take it and some of that fall growth, you can stockpile it to graze on into the November and December period and do a pretty good job with that. Now, once we have a pretty good, perennial grass base, one of the focuses that we should always have is to try to have legumes in every grass pasture that we have. And there's, several different options. I would say probably the three major options that people go toward are going to be either white clover or red clover, or a lot of times people will try to use alfalfa. And we use, these are all good, strong legumes that give us lots of benefits. And, some of the benefits that sometimes I think we don't always concentrate on, but we know we get them, is number one, we're going to get an improved forage quality when we start adding those legumes to these grass pastures. So we're going to improve the protein content. We're going to improve the energy content of that pasture. And so from that, we're going to get improved production from the animals that are grazing that. The other real important benefit is we get a decreased need for nitrogen fertilization. So we can, we know these legumes, they will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and it gets recycled through that pasture so that those grasses can also use that nitrogen. And you can basically a lot of times cut out your spring nitrogen if you have a good standard legume in there. And then another thing that we can see is possibly based on the legume that you are choosing, you can actually lengthen your grazing season with over just a straight grass pasture by having these legumes. So I just thought I'd show you a little bit of data that kind of illustrates a couple of these points. This was some work that was done here in Tennessee several years ago, where they took tall fescue and they fertilized it with 60 pounds of nitrogen, which is that green line, or they grew fescue with either red clover, white clover, or a mixture of red clover, white clover, and annual aspidism. And they followed the yield over the course of the season. And what you end up seeing with this, if you follow that green line, you see a big burst of growth right there in the spring. And that's, not unusual. We're used to, you put nitrogen on grass, it greens up and it grows really quick. But you got that real quick burst, but then the growth from that point of the season on was not real great. You got a lot there at the beginning, but it wasn't spread over a long period of time. If you compare that to where you were using the legumes in there with the fescue, what you end up seeing is that now you didn't get that big burst of growth in the spring. You got more of a steady kind of a growth over the course of that season. So by the time that you got into that June and July, you ended up with the same yield as you did fescue fertilized with 60 pounds of N. It just didn't come all at one time. It was spread over a longer period of time. So this just kind of is some data that shows you can save on nitrogen, and it can extend that grazing season. So once we take tall fescues, and we plant say red and white clover in it, we have a pretty good system right there. But again, we see that we have that slump during the summertime. And so if we start having a situation where we get dry, we start getting up into the mid to upper 80s and the 90s, tall fescue is going to slump. It's not adapted to those kind of conditions. And so what we see is that there's not really going to be one forage species that's going to solve all our problems. So one of the things that we really suggest people to do is when you start thinking about your forage program, think of it in terms of kind of a monthly calendar like this. And your goal should be to have as level of forage production for every month of the year as you possibly can. And you're not going to be able to do it with just one forage species. So, a lot of times what we see in this Mid-South area is a lack of forage production during that summertime, specifically that kind of late June, July, August period. So what we recommend then is for somebody to take, and that would be where you could use some sort of a warm season forage that's going to have this growth curve right here. It's going to start to grow in that May and June period. It's going to do pretty well up through kind of September. And so what now we have done is we have used two different forage species that now we're starting to level our forage production curve. So we're not having, sometimes of the year where we've got too much forage and then other times where we don't have enough. And so that is where we recommend for people to look, is where do you have a forage lack, and choose a forage species that specifically fills that gap. And so when we start looking at different type of summer forages, we have several options. I've just listed a few here. We have several different annuals that we could potentially use, and then several different perennials. And, we could spend hours talking about the pros and the cons of each one of these different species. And, we don't have time for that. And so we're not going to try to tell you, here's exactly the species you need to use. Maybe everybody needs to use Bermuda grass, or maybe everybody needs to use pearl millet. That's not what we're trying to do. But what we do want to encourage you to think about is choosing something off this list. You may be in a situation where, okay, you're not able to grow some of the perennials. Maybe you're not able to grow Bermuda grass or something like that, but you might be able to grow a few acres of sorghum Sudan grass, or maybe crabgrass, something like that. and that way it will fill in that summertime slump that a lot of times causes us to overgraze, and then we end up killing some of our cool season stands just because of the overgrazing. So I guess the thing to think of is, okay, where exactly do you start in this situation? And so here is generally what we recommend. Okay, so for this Mid-South area, we're going to say, okay, you're going to start with tall fescue, which we know is going to give us grazing in that September to November period, and then again kind of March through June. And then we're going to have some warm season forages that we're going to use that are going to give us kind of that May to September kind of a program. And usually what we recommend is something like having 75% of your acres devoted to cool season grazing, and then maybe about 25% of your acres going toward warm season grazing. Now, based on, maybe where you're at, you might adjust these numbers slightly. Maybe it needs to be 80-20. Maybe it needs to be, 70-30. But the point is to have a specific plan to grow forage both during the cool season as well as during that warm season. The thing that we're talking about here is having actually separate forage systems. But there's also people that try to mix these so that they have both cool and warm season forage species growing in the same pasture, and it's possible to do. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to make sure that you have a really good grazing management program, because my experience has been if you're trying to grow cool and warm season grasses in the same pasture, cattle tend to prefer the cool season grasses, and so they tend to graze those out. So you got to make sure that you control the grazing management, so you force the animals to eat everything. Otherwise, they're going to graze out in the cool season grasses, and you're going to lose the stand of those things. And so this kind of a program is something that we recommend. Now, if you go further south, then what's going to happen is it's probably going to flip to a certain extent. There's going to be based mostly on warm season forages. Maybe it's going to be Bermuda grass. And so then what that in that system, what somebody's going to do is overseed that with some sort of maybe a cool season annual, overseed with annual ryegrass or wheat or something like that. And then when they have that program, then they can have both of those mixtures together. And so basically, if you take this program that we just talked about, where you have tall fescue, this is going to be basically the growth curve that you have. If you have some Bermuda grass and maybe 25% of your acres to Bermuda grass, you're going to get this type of a forage yield curve. And so if you can start to see how you're starting to kind of level out your forage production. If you take that Bermuda grass, then you overseed that with some wheat, then you're going to get a forage yield curve that kind of follows along this line. And now all of a sudden what you've done with, in this case, simply using tall fescue, red and white clover, Bermuda grass, and wheat, we've just got 5 forage species, and pretty much everything except the wheat is perennial. What we have is a pretty solid forage program where we don't have these big times of the year where we have too much forage, followed by a time of the year where we have a lack of forage and we're overgrazing. But you can graze the fescue. When the fescue starts to slump, you put them onto the acres that have the Bermuda grass. You graze that until that's gone. You flip them back over onto the fescue. You overseed that Bermuda grass with wheat, and it just kind of moves very smoothly from one to the other. And hopefully what you've done here is, instead of having to feed hay, 100 or 120 days, maybe you've cut your hay feeding down to 60, 75 days, something along those lines. And that is done primarily through your forage species selection. So I guess the thing that I want to make sure that, we think about on this is, number one, you need to diversify your forage system. Okay, and one of the key tools that we have to try to lengthen our grazing systems, our seasons, and decrease the amount of stored feed that we need is through our species selection. And so we need to make sure that we have a program where we are looking at both our cool and our warm seasons and so that we can very specifically meet the cattle's needs during both of those times of the year. And then something that we can, you can never focus on enough is you need to make sure that we have legumes in every grass pasture that we have, because that way we get the nitrogen as well as the improved quality. And so if you go through this process, making sure that you use perennial grasses, and based on where you are, that could be cool season, warm season, and then look at that off season that you have and try to choose other forage species that fit those needs, and then focus on legumes. You've actually got the beginnings right there of an extremely strong forage program that doing that insulates you a little bit against some of these weather extremes that we get, and particularly droughts. If you have a plan for both the cool and the warm season, then if we get a drought during the summertime, you won't be hurt nearly as bad if you have a warm season program compared to if you only have cool season grasses. And so that's kind of a summary of the process that you need to go through in terms of selecting your forage system and which forage species that you want to use. And again, like I said, there's so many different forage species that we have the possibility to plant and graze across our nation that it's hard to, we wish we had a lot more time to cover all those, but that's the basic process. And so I think now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Gene Fults, who Chad had mentioned. He's an NRCS Rangeland Specialist, kind of based in the West. And I think what he's going to do now is talk about kind of what is the process in developing a forage program for areas of our nation that maybe don't get quite as much rainfall as we do on the eastern half of the state.
Okay, Gary, thanks. I'm Gene Fults, and I appreciate everybody listening. There are an awful lot of rough edges out there in central and western United States, these rangeland areas. So often it's not real easy to make a forage system fit in. But there's some daring people out there who have been trying to do that for many years now. Just to give you an example of that, of these rough edges, is basically what the cows share the land with. These photos are from a rancher up around Kettle Valley up in British Columbia. I thought I'd share them with you because they're pretty unique. You notice on that first photo, that blonde and white Simmental cow went right for the bear. She was totally aware of it. Rancher Wayne wrote that she was, a very good mother. She was about 12 years old, and she kind of knew that bears were bad news. In the third and fourth photos, you might notice that that bear was getting pretty scrappy. But watch the younger red white-faced cow move in for support. The little bear eventually had enough. But those cows aren't high-fiving each other on the success. They're still totally stressed out. They probably won't do any more grazing today. They'll probably be tomorrow before they settle down a little bit. Those calves are still needing to nurse. And so if that rancher hadn't been out there that day in order to capture these photos, he'd be wondering, why were his calf weights off this year? Why didn't they get enough? But that's the biggest thing about these interactions in the western United States and forage systems, is a lot of times 2 + 2 doesn't always add up to 4. So just briefly, there's the inventory. You all are part of a huge part of the system here. There's about 2 billion acres, surface acres in the United States. There's about a third of it is non-federal grazing lands. Whenever you throw in the federal land, which is in the gray areas there on the map, you're getting up around 45% of the land area. So you all are part of a very large land use and land base. Let's see. Trying to get the advance here.
click on it, Gene, and then use your arrow button on your.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right. So thanks, Chad. So where's the weak link? A lot of times it's just a simple observation. We can figure out where the weak links are. But I'd like to talk a little bit about looking at your calendar of ranch events, talk a little bit about systems ecology, then going into understanding some of the spatial scale variations that's involved with the beef operation, and then finally look at some forage systems or examples of forage systems in the West. So it'd really be nice if our forage calendar looked like this, like Gary was talking about. April, May, June, just had everything going smooth all, 12 months of the year. But still, there's still going to be those problems. In this particular case, larkspur would still be there, a poisonous plant. So there's all kinds of issues out there on the grazing lands. And the idea of the forage system is to use those mixtures of species that's going to achieve the nutrient requirements that the grazing animals need. So plants are changing every day, the quality and quantities. The animal changes her nutritional requirements all the way through her life cycle. And so your forage systems is a constantly moving target, and you have to really pay a lot of attention to what's going on out there. A lot of your universities do have publications about a lot of the forage grasses. Western Oregon and Washington has a lot of those northern forage species that Gary was talking about. But they did it a little bit differently. They identified different grassland growth periods, and they went in and described management considerations, the watch out type of things, do this, don't do that. I think they did a real good job of getting the information in based upon these ecological cues that's going on in the introduced forage species. So the analogy here is that, the rumen, that fabulous machine that keeps these animals going, that you can manipulate that rumen by providing the right amount of diet, nutrients, and supplements, and that heifer is going to do really, really good. So the same concept is what you want to apply to managing your forage systems on the ranch. Using that calendar, going ahead and getting all those things that are going on inside of your head down on paper. It's going to help you out. It's going to make it easier for you to explain things. And if you have a hired hand, it's going to make it easier for you to explain when they need to be out there and why. And culling, of course, does not get rid of stuff you don't want. Culling is keeping all of the essential items needed for that system to operate properly. And probably one of the most important ones is monitoring. Because of the dynamics of the system that you're operating in, you have to keep track of vegetation changes and various important aspects of that plant community as it changes through that forage season. This rancher here is doing a step point, a green line along the riparian area, been doing some management, trying to enhance that area. And so this is just something that you'd have to do annually. I mean, we can all look at it and say it's getting better, but if we don't measure it and write it down, it doesn't have as much value to you or in your explanation to anybody else. So, what's the next thing we look at? Systems ecology. All right, whether you like it or not, or whether you know it or not, as livestock operators, landowners, and land managers, you all are systems ecologists. You aren't just out there driving around on the ranch having a good time. You're thinking about a lot of different things. You have a lot of systems that are impacting your business side of things, the weather side of things, your enterprise side of things. You aren't just out there. Occasionally, yeah, you will have the daydream about, the bad guy getting his just deserves, or really celebrating that cow's impact on that bear. But systems ecologist has been around really about 80 years now. Started out at 1966. They started realizing about the interactions of these forage systems and ecosystems, and how you could use that information to help predict what's going to happen next. So it's a combination of living and non-living components out there: soil, solar radiation, the plants, the animals, and how they interact. So general differences here in systems thinking. A closed system would be like an engineering manufacturing process where, 2 + 2 is always going to equal 4. You have a certain amount of linear dynamics to it. You know what's going to happen. On the open system, there's a lot of management and operational complexity to it. There's a lot of cross-scale interactions. The product, as I said, is non-linear. Sometimes you get more, sometimes you get less. But the main thing is there's that free flow of energy. And that free flow of energy basically comes from solar radiation. It's driving those plants, producing the carbon, the nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, if you notice there on that table, there's a certain amount of accumulation that goes on in between the plants and the mammals. Their daily diet of nitrogen, that gets that crude protein, a little bit of phosphorus. It starts to accumulate in these open systems. And that's some of that nonlinear kind of interactions that's going on. So over there on the left, that chart going up to free energy, you start out with a simple compound. It releases the energy, combines with another compound, releases that energy, and the energy continues to increase till you cut open that steak, put it in your mouth, and start chewing. And that's probably some of the best free energy that I've ever had in my life. So, understanding the spatial scale which the beef operation occurs in. This is pretty important because you might read about somebody doing a particular management thing and it really works out great for them. And you might try it, but can't figure out why it doesn't really work for you. So you really have to understand where they are in their world, because even though you might be in the same region, you may be in a little bit different type of land structure, and you may have a different type of ecological site. And so there's knowing the scale of your ranch and the resources that are on the ranch is going to be helpful to keep you from making those mistakes of trying something that never really had a chance to be successful. So the land resource hierarchy, it's most of you will be operating in that order 4 in the bottom half of that triangle, where you might have a group of ecological sites. Kind of gives you the idea of the scale there: 3 inches to a mile, 1 inch to 55 miles up at the top. And so you get right down to that observation of plant and soil relationships. That's kind of where the animal, the plant, and the soil have those cross interactions. So there's also a spatial scale for grazing. Right there at that bite or at the feeding station, you can kind of see where these animals have fed in there before, and they were rested. There's a certain amount of regrowth that went on before they came back into these feeding stations. And again, most of you will be operating somewhere in that feeding site, feeding station bite type of area as far as scale goes. Now, if you have some federal leases on federal land or very, very large ranches, well, then you may have those larger, higher spatial scales to consider. So yeah, localized storms, rainfall events, they can change where those camps and feeding site areas are. You know, the raindrop, we normally think of it as being a teardrop, but actually it's kind of a flat bottom hamburger bun type of thing. So it can hit the soil and it can cause a lot of damage. So a lot of your grazing management should be focused on making sure you keep cover. That way that moisture, which is very precious, will soak into the soil and not run off easily. If you're out there whenever it's too wet, you can actually reduce the amount of forage that gets produced just by shrinking the area where the grass plant has to gather resources. So you can see that the plant on the left was not stepped on when the soil was wet. It's got a fairly wide open root system. The one on the right, that one was right inside of a puck mark, and those roots have been crushed, and so you can see the reduced vigor of the wheatgrass there. And that happens right there at the bite scale. There's seasonality of the feeding sites. The green dots represent where the cows were in April, and the red dots when they were in the fall. So the seasonality, depending on when you put them out there, that really changes where they're going to be feeding. You might also use this type of information to figure out, well, if I was to put in a supplemental water, where might I put that? Or if I'm going to be doing supplemental feeding, where would be a good place to attract them in? Okay, so let's look at some examples of forage systems. Prescribed fire and patch grazing, that's starting to become pretty popular in certain areas. Basically, what they do is burn off a small patch within a pasture, and then 30 days later, that all greens up. You're providing some pretty nutritious forage for those animals. Once you get the system going, you can either do spring burns, fall burns, and you just rotate that around your entire pasture. After you get started and the cattle get used to it, you can just leave them in the pasture, and basically you kind of rotate them around without having to use any fences. It's also a good way to control any of the smaller woody species which may be invading the site. It's kind of a two-edged sword. Some of those rough edges, if you have a wildfire come through, that wildfire cannot have come through at a worse time for that cow and her calf. She's basically 30 days away from her peak lactation, peak demand for that calf. So if you're in those areas where you do have wildfires, you just got to plan on this. You got to expect it to happen. You need to have that calendar lined out. You need to know where some other places are that you might be able to take your animals in order to have the feed that they need. So this is some of those unexpected rough areas that you have to be motivated before it happens in order to be prepared for it. A lot of riparian areas out here, so if you look at that top photo, you can kind of see the cowboy hat in the willows there. He's got his horse in there. He's trying to make sure gets all the cows out. He's got a good dog with him. Tries to get that stray to keep them bunched up. I read somewhere where there's like 60 different dog breeds that are specifically made for livestock handling. And then you bunch them up and you move them on to another area. And this riparians need extra care because of the hydrology and the water flows. That does a lot of disturbance. There's just a normal disturbance there. You also have a lot of other wildlife species that come into that area kind of uncontrolled. So we as humans and managers, we try to take care of our livestock and make sure we can keep them moving. Winter feeding, there's quite a few of those, stockpiling, windrow grazing, bale grazing. Then, of course, there's always the dual-purpose wheat. So on some of the warm season pastures, that last 70 days of the growing season, that's whenever you might want to fertilize it, going into and use it for fall grazing. Or if it's a native meadow or something, you might want to go ahead and cut it then, because you don't want to wait till the end of the year because the plants are going to lose their quality. So if you clip it, it's going to maintain the quality at that time of year. Various deals about ice and snow just stops the grazing. Windrows, the wind blows. It makes it a little bit more difficult if you think that you're going to move the hot wire around in an even manner. It causes logistic problems. The protein supplementation, sometimes it can be stimulative, which is really good for the low digestible forages. It can be additive if you're just wanting to make sure your heifers are in good shape. And other times it's just a substitute. So if you have some real high quality forage, you're feeding them that high protein supplement, they will just go ahead and eat the protein supplement and lay down and wait. So it may be a way of extending some of that forage season around. You can also use it to train animal behavior. This was a small scale where they supplemented the cattle, made them eat the sagebrush. You see the baby calf there is starting to learn how to use it. And then the end results of that would be those animals are a little bit more aware. They'll go ahead and use sagebrush out there on the range. But it also has a direct benefit to the forage produced on those sites. It takes 3 years. It's not an immediate thing, so you really need to understand the timing of these things. Up in Alaska, they have reindeer grazing, where the reindeer primarily feed on the lichen. That deep purple there on that screen is their major forage that they graze on. In the summer, they will use the grasses and sedges and a little bit of the willows. But this is one of those places where they have to just find those areas. It's extensive. The Alaskan people follow them around, and it's just way too expensive to bring any other supplements up there. Out on the islands, in the Northern Mariana Islands, they during the dry season they'll do a cut and carry system where they'll keep the animals penned up, and then they'll drive around the road banks and road ditches and get an armful of this Guatemala grass and bring it into them and keep them fed that way. They use tether grazing. This is the caraboa on Guam. Very interesting animal, and it's very important to the Chamorro people. Whenever they have a celebration or a wedding, well, then they'll go ahead and harvest one of these animals, and it will be part of the feast. Gary talked about the legumes. Well, this is a tree legume, Luciana, and a lot of times they will cut that at about 3 foot high and let the animals browse the regrowth, or they'll go ahead and cut it every 60 days and bring it in on the cut and carry. Strip grazing annuals, that's been around for a long time, but look at the differences in the harvest efficiency, which is how much actually gets into the animal, versus the amount of residue that's left on the soil. So depending upon your objectives, will help you choose which one of those annuals that you'd want to put on there. Sometimes you want to get that harvest efficiency so that they put it out as manure as opposed to just residue or stubble. And they do, I mean, down in Florida, they did a study where they had rotationally, and they got some college students go out there and locate all the cow chips in a 24-hour period. And so you can see that the continuous grazed, the cow chips are rather clustered in some areas, same way with just a weekly rotation, but the most uniformly distributed was on those animals doing the daily rotation. And that daily, they called it a daily ration grazing. So basically they're giving it enough forage for that animal for one day. That's been around for about 80 years too. Just quickly about the grazing systems. Once you get on the number of paddocks, once you get past 6 or 8, you aren't really gaining that much as far as the amount of rest that the rest of the pastures have. And then on your fencing, those square pastures, you actually use less fence than you would with the wagon wheel design. So summary, just trying to find the right fit requires looking at that ranch calendar, doing the right spatial scale, understanding your system's ecology, and still using those basic stocking rate principles of proper stocking rate, kind of animal, proper distribution, and the timing of grazing. So thank you for listening. And now I'll turn it over to Jerry Doan with Blackleg Ranch up in North Dakota.
Well, thanks, Gene. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate everyone the opportunity to visit with you a little tonight. Hopefully I'll take a little bit of the background that these presenters gave you and try to put it into a little bit of practicality in a ranch setting. I'm the slide on your screen there is my great-grandfather actually came down out of Canada and in 1878 ended up in Kansas and then came back up to Dakota Territory in 1882 and homesteaded here. That's actually a picture of the sod house. And we're just off the Missouri River on the east side in southern North Dakota, the northern plains. It's pretty good grass country and quite a bit of farming going on as well. See if this works for me. It sure does. So I just wanted to throw a picture of my family up there. My wife, Renee, and I are in the back. Obviously, Renee's the boss. I'm smart enough to know that after all these years. My daughter, Shanda, there, and her kids are the 6th generation, and they help us on the ranch when they can. And then all 3 boys, and I guess we're a little different in that all 3 of my boys went off to college across the country and worked somewhere and all decided they wanted to come back to the ranch and the cattle industry and agriculture in North Dakota. And we're really excited about that. But as all of you out there listening to this webinar tonight know, that creates some issues. Families are a challenge and trying to make ends meet and everything. And so we've done a lot of things different and which has both made it fun and helped us move forward. This is, we're, like I said, just off the east side of the Missouri River here in North Dakota. And when I was growing up on this ranch, that hill there, it's similar, I suppose, to the Sand Hills in Nebraska, actually. And there would have been no grass on those hills. And what caused that? It was years and years of season-long grazing. What we had done, and I'm not criticizing the earlier generations, they did what they thought was right at the time, but you narrowed the species. The only species that you would have saw out there would have been blue grama grass, and a lot of bare ground and sand showing. And if you go back and explore when Lewis and Clark first came to this country, in their journals, it talked about the vast, abundant grasslands that were saddle high. And what made those? It was those massive herds of buffalo that came in and almost, you could say, annihilated the land in a way with such hoof action and grazing. But then they didn't come back for a year or two or three, and you had this vast diversity and vibrant grass. And so that's what we try to do with our planned grazing. This next slide here shows that same hill, and by putting a large number of cattle in there, short duration, the big blue stem is running right up that slope. And I get people come to the ranch and they'll say, so how did you plant that? And I jokingly say, big John Deere air seeder. I guess I was surprised that seed bed is still there from all those years. But what we've done is seen some real change and diversity come back. I guess I probably should tell a little bit about that. We're really involved in regenerative agriculture. Sustainability is the big buzzword out there. I honestly don't care much for the term sustainable, because I don't want to sustain something that is a bit degraded. We need to regenerate it. And I'm really into trying to regenerate these natural resources, including wildlife, and bring them back to what they were when Lewis and Clark and others first came here. We're a holistically managed operation. I took my first holistic training under Alan Savory, and I've done it since then, and it's changed our operation. I'd like to just touch on a couple of goals. I think it's important for us in agriculture as ranchers and generational ranchers to at least think about where are we going and where do we want to be in. And we're multi-generational. We're on our 6th generation now. That's very important to me, and it kind of directs what I do. And honestly, one of the things that I want to do is turn that ranch over to the next generation in better shape than I got it. And so it's a big goal for me and helps me move forward in that. Another goal that we have, and it's kind of different than most agriculture, is we brought diversity back into our operation, not only in our diversity in the grasslands, diversity in our cropland, but diversity in our operations within our ranch. We've added some diverse operations that help us and are able to help bring those kids back into the operation. And I don't have time to spend in all of that stuff tonight, but again, diversity is very keen to us. In agriculture, we've tended to, if you're a wheat guy, you tended to just grow wheat. If you're a corn and beans guy, that's what you did. If you're a cow guy, we went away from that. And in our case, diversity has been very good to us, and we think it's worth mentioning, and we keep it as a goal. And then the last two I'd like to mention, and if anybody out there's heard me talk as I talk around the country, is we miss profitability and we miss our quality of life over and over. We've almost learned in agriculture and in the cattle industry to accept that profitability isn't there. And I've heard many people just talk that way, and it always frustrates me. I think we can have profitability. Now, we can't just do things the way we've done them for the last 100 years and expect it to be that way. You got to think a little bit and do some things, and I think we can get there. We have proven that on our ranch, and part of that is embracing holistic management and getting our whole operation in sync with Mother Nature where we can, and making that work to our advantage. And then the last thing, like I mentioned, is quality of life. I see way too many people that don't enjoy what they're doing and complain about it, but yet keep doing it. And I guess I probably did that for half of my life, but we're trying to do that different now. And my 3 boys coming back and their excitement and their energy and their ideas and not wanting to do it the same old way all the time has kind of reinvigorated me, and we are working on that. And so I wanted to mention that because I really do believe that we can have those things in a cattle operation, but you've got to work at it a little bit. This next picture here is just talking about bringing diversity back into that. Again, that's that same hilltop that I showed you. So it went from virtually, and I don't have a very early picture. The first one I showed you showed some grass on it, but when I was a kid, there was no grass. You know, that was pure bare sand. And then we got that big blue stem moving up the slopes, which you can see there, but then you've got purple prairie clover and 100 other plants coming in there. You know, I didn't understand, the other guys on here know these things way better than I do. But purple prairie clover is a legume that's, again, one of these synergistic plants within this very diverse native rangeland that we probably don't understand all that well, but we do know enough to know that these things complement each other, and we want that diversity in there to have a very successful plant community. On our operation now, we move our cows every 1 to 7 days. You know, depending on what we're doing, how we're doing it, we've divided up to where we've got 100 pastures, and it's made a huge difference. Now, I would tell you one thing. In my opinion, in the Northern Plains, if I'm just trying to improve the natural resource, I'm trying to improve that rangeland, and I've proven this on my place, on my place here. A once over graze on it, I can improve the rangeland, but that's talking about a lot of cattle in a very small area for a very short time and move, and then let it recover and wait a year to come back. And you know, I get it, we're not going to do it the same time every year. But I would like to say this, because sometimes in intensive type grazing, performance gets speed up, and I think it's because we miss it a bit. And I had to prove it on our own place because we had some of those issues. And we had some yearling heifers we were grazing, and we tested this, and we were getting and using the nutritional balancer test out of Texas A&M, and we were getting, according to that computer model test, we were getting about a pound a gain on these heifers. And of course, here in North Dakota, as you go into August, and if you're grazing things that haven't been grazed yet, you're going to get in some pretty mature grass. And so it's understandable that your gains are going to go down. Well, this was the challenge we were having, is trying to keep that performance up. Well, what we did then was went to a pasture that had 75 days of rest on, much more nutritious and vibrant. And immediately when we did that, the nutritional balancer test showed us that we jumped a full pound. We went from 1 pound to 2 pounds. And so when we need to have performance in these, it's not quite as important in the cow-calf setting, but if you're grazing yearlings or your own replacement heifers or something, then we can do that and we can bring that performance back, but we've got to modify that a bit and use some of that higher quality grass. And Gary had a great point about, you know, species, and you can interseed some things. Even we've done some of that with Sizer milk vetch here on some old worn out brome grass type pastures, and really seen some change and things improve. So I think there's plenty of opportunity in there, and if you use your head a little bit, you can make this work. And okay, I have a picture here of actually 74 days of rest, which would have fit right into when we were grazing those heifers, and you can see quality is much better, higher protein, all those sorts of things. And this is late in the growing season, but it had been grazed off once. And I know in some of, you know, as you move further south, you guys can have much quicker rotations than we can have here. I would like to say this. our areas in the country are different, and we have to do things differently, but the principles are the same. So you take the principles and then you adapt them to your region. Don't just discount them because I'm in the north and you're somewhere else. The principles are the same. You just need to adapt them. Now, if I could have every one of the pastures I come out of look like this, that would be perfect, where we're actually, whatever we're not grazing, we're knocked down, we're putting that carbon back in the soil, we're starting that whole cycle over again. You know, they don't always look that perfect, but that's our goal, is to try to get that on the ground. Does no good sticking up. So very important for us to have that as a goal as well. Now, when we have that kind of litter on the ground, something that took me a long time in the previous webinar that was all about soil health. We're very engaged in soil health here. It's I think where we need to go. Consumers are starting to demand it, and there will come a time, I think, in not too distant future, where the consumer is going to really connect human health, soil health, and we're going to be demanded to have it. And those of us that are engaged in it, hopefully find some benefit in that, and the rest of agriculture is going to have to come along. My opinion, of course, but I really do believe that, and soil health is a big deal. Now, as we have this kind of litter and things on the ground, our infiltration has really went up. So now we're not running that water down the slope anymore and putting it in the Missouri River. It's going into our ground. So when we get into these dry spells, we're in much better shape going through a drought, because the moisture we get is going in. And the other thing we're not doing is evaporating it. When you have a lot of bare ground, we evaporate so much moisture. In our country, where we're always short, this is a big deal. And as we increase that, we're also increasing our biology, and our soil health and organic matter are moving up the scale, and that's a good thing. Now that's kind of in a nutshell, and this is very quick and brief, but talking about grazing system here. And I'm going to run into cover crops, because it's a big deal, and we can talk a lot about building soil health with it. But we have three goals in our cover crops. Number one is, in the northern plains, what's killing the cattle industry? It's winter feed costs. And I said our goal is to never feed a bale of hay. Now, we know that we've done it quite a few years, but we also know Mother Nature can be cruel, and you've got to have a backup plan. Number two is, could we build soil health back on some depleted organic matter fields that had been from summer fallow and wheat over years, are not all that good. And I'm proud to say that we did build that soil back. And then propagate wildlife. We have a hunting business here, but we love wildlife, and it's the consumer wants it, and it's a good tool to talk about. Okay, I'm throwing up my cover crop mix here, and not to get all caught up in what's the proper mix. The proper mix is have a lot of diversity. There's there's a lot of legumes in there. There's your brassicas in there. Three things on there, and they're in yellow, that I really like for winter grazing. It's the brown midrib grazing corn. It's got a shorter, higher sugar content. The forage collards, it's a leafy, it's like cabbage without the head. They stay green even in North Dakota clear into December, or if we get some snow on top of them, they'll stay green all winter, and the cows can dig through and get them. And then I like several kinds of millets in there. So we try to keep these costs down. These are full season cover crops, because we're trying to grow some real material, and we can get 5 ton out of this, not every year, but a lot of years. And then the key is to only graze half of it, try to feed the soil with the other half. And so this is what it looks like. And actually, this very diverse mix has sunflower in it. We've had to take the sunflower out. We are in the prairie pothole region. We are the duck factory of the northern plains. But we also have blackbirds, and the blackbirds have been devastating us on the cover crops, because they love these sunflowers. I love the sunflowers in there, but when I take them out, I don't mind if the blackbirds eat the sunflowers, but then they eat the millet and everything else in there. If I take the sunflowers out, they leave them alone. So we've kind of had to change the mix a little bit. But This is what it looks like when we're grazing, and we're grazing cover crops right now. We've been grazing all winter long. We had to feed a couple of times. We had some 30 below weather with some pretty ugly weather here. And our cover crop, we rotate on these, and we were kind of at the end of that rotation. So we never bring those cows into the watershed anymore in the riparian area, because that ends up going down the Missouri River as well. And we need to pay attention of what the public's saying about that. And so now we'll take hay out there, or you can cube these cattle or whatever you want if you're running short of protein or whatever. And what that does is keeps all the manure and urine out on the land, and we're building that soil health, which is increasing. If you come back on with a cash crop or anything, we're able to do that by cutting our input costs. We've actually done it where we've compared yield side by side and raised just as good a corn with no fertilizer as a university recommendation right next to it. So it's not always perfect. You have to work at it, but obviously that's the goal, to bring that profitability and to dang sure improve that soil health. And the big benefit here is this is huge for wildlife, because it's winter feed for wildlife and it's winter feed for these cattle. And we do test using that nutritional balancer program again to see if we're getting somewhere close. And so far we've always been able to, it depends on the quality of our cover crops, but we've been able to go clear through and meet their needs, even now as we go into the third trimester. Now, I might mention a couple of things, because you get into these grass-based systems and trying to cut costs and things, you got to take a look at your cow type. And I won't ever tell anybody I got the right kind of cows and you got the wrong color or type or anything. But I do know the bigger cows didn't work in this system for us. We had to bring them down. We're kind of shooting for 1,100 pound cows. We're trying to graze more beef per acre, not more beef per animal. That's where true profitability for our ranch is. And then the other thing we did different is move to a May and June calving. We used to calve like everybody else. In the wintertime, the deer around here fawn in May and June, and I don't know why I never watched them before, but we did that 20 years ago, and I would say to everybody that's listening, it was the number one best economic decision we ever made on this ranch, and it brought profitability back to us really well. So, again, I'm telling you what worked for us. Hopefully I give you some ideas, some things to think about, and you can take them and utilize them however you want, or ask questions. And then after, this would be a field after winter grazing. As you can see, we have to leave something for the biology in the soil. So there's a lot of material there, but it's 100% covered, or virtually 100% covered. And again, as I talked about improving infiltration in native rangeland, this improves the infiltration in that cropland. We had a pretty serious drought 2 years ago. I could go out in our cover crop fields, and everybody else was struggling. They couldn't, the crops looked terrible, and yet we had good moisture. So it got it, and had good crops. Now you start getting multiple years. Obviously, it isn't going to keep you going forever, but it dang sure will get you through those tough spots. And this evaporation thing is huge, because in our country, we evaporated more water than we ever used. And by keeping that temperature down and keeping that soil surface covered, and it also helps with weeds. Now we still have to cheat and use some herbicides here and there, and maybe we always will, but we're starting to see that organic matter move up the scale, and that's pretty exciting to see as well. The other thing, and I don't know if I mentioned this as I was talking about the winter grazing, we're able to save $200 per head when we can go through a whole winter without feeding hay. And that's taken off the land charge, the cover crop charge. But like I said, you've got to have a backup plan. Mother Nature comes along, dumps a big blizzard on you. We've grazed those cows through 200 snowfall years, but it didn't come all at once. And those cows can graze through. Now, Gene mentioned the ice in his one slide. That's a problem. That's where it gets us, is if we get freezing and thawing, and you get crusted over. Now, we grazed pretty good this year, and we've had some of that, but we're coming back around a bit to a couple of cover crop fields that weren't grazed that well, and now that we've got some melt off, we go back to them and graze some of that again. So again, some opportunities. You've got to work with these systems and work around Mother Nature, plan and replan, and have backup plans. It's kind of bringing me to the end here. I know they want some questions and things. I just like to say a couple of things in closing here. And if anybody's out there, you want to email me or go to blacklegranch.com, you're more than welcome to. We run an agritourism business here, and our goal in that is to spread a positive message about agriculture and the cattle industry across the country. And we've had people from all 50 states and 40 foreign countries here, and I can tell you, many people think agriculture is broken, and we have got to fix that message. It's the whole methane issue is out of whack. They think we're part of the blame for climate change. They think we're ruining the streams and the rivers. And I only say this not to scare anybody, but I talk to these people that come through here for all this stuff, and that's what they say. And so we're trying to, in our small way, change that, and all the rest of us need to do it as well. I'm convinced we can bring profitability and the quality of life back to ranching and make it fun again. And that allows this next generation to come back and be excited. They won't come back if they can't be excited. When I'm off speaking, I constantly get the question. I just spoke three talks in Colorado here a month ago. And there was a ton of young people there. It was so exciting, but they all come up. How do we embrace any of these things? Dad won't move over. Dad won't allow us to change. We want to do the same thing forever. That's not an easy question to answer and I said, try to get them to seminars, try to talk them into letting you use 40 acres and do some cover crops or planting. But all you folks out there got to realize, if we want the young generation to come back, and I had to get this, I couldn't stand in their way. It's not always perfect. They don't always do everything you wish they would do. But I can tell you, it's darn sure exciting when they come back and come up with new ideas and new things. And it makes the cattle industry and agriculture fun again. So with that, it's sure been an honor to be here, and I'm wide open to thoughts or questions or whatever. So thank you.
Thank you, Jerry and Dr. Bates and Gene for the insightful presentations tonight. I'm really excited for the rest of the series and truly appreciate all the collaboration and expertise we get to hear on the webinars this month. As we really start moving into our question and answer session, I wanted to highlight, another opportunity when we really think about grazing and all our discussions today of Jerry talking about that generational transfer and soil health and grazing management and all of these is the National Grazing Land Coalition. We're having our first summer tour coming. It's going to be held in the Nebraska Sandhills, June 14th through the 16th, and really encourage folks to look it up and come join us. And it's a great opportunity to visit with other ranchers across the country, as well as to really the tour is really going to highlight grazing management of these diversified ranch operations and really ever increasing issues of that transferring the ranch operation to the next generation. As Jerry mentioned, we're going to see some great ranches, 6 or 7 ranches, starting off with the Rex Ranch. We're also going to see the Shovel Dot Ranch, who Homer Buell is the rancher, and he's another past ESAP Environmental Stewardship Award winner. So I hope you guys can join us this summer. But I want to remind everybody and everyone that the webinars will be available for viewing at the producer tab at www.ncba.org. And you'll see the Cattlemen's Webinar Series option listed. So you can also register for the next webinar in the series. The next webinar is going to be Grazing Management, Balancing Animal and Forage Performance. And it's scheduled for March 17th at 7 p.m. Central. So now let's get to, I know, your questions and some of your thoughts. Again, I want to thank again our participant for you participating in the webinar tonight. And I'm going to hand it off to Josh White, who leads NCBA's producer education team, to moderate the Q&A. I guess, Josh, maybe before I hand it off, I kind of like to start it off with the question. And Jerry, I appreciate and respect so much of what you do and your family do there at Blackleg Ranch. You really, kind of talked really, I mean, this whole series tonight is really, talking about the forage system. And, you kind of talked about, your aspects of the crop side and, kind of filling those gaps and increasing. And I think you really highlighted, I think one of the key principles, right, that you mentioned that works everywhere is rest, and that key, and where you have changed that forage. You talked a little bit, Jerry, about, the cattle side. So it's, once we get that forage system in place, we're needing to match our livestock performance and that system overlay. And you kind of mentioned, you change your calving season, you change the size of your cattle. Could you maybe talk a little bit more, Jerry, of, that didn't happen overnight, and how did you think through it from a producer perspective, step by step, and staying steady and still trying to make a profit and stay in business?
Well, it's a great question, Chad, and part of our problem in agriculture, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but we're so traditional. And so when you step outside, and I went through this, and people are cruel. I thought it was North Dakota, but I learned as I got to get off and speak around the country, it's everywhere. People tend to criticize if if most of your people are calving in February or March, and all of a sudden you're calving in May and June, and you got small calves. They can be cruel to you. A lot of people, especially young producers, can't handle that very well, and we need to support them. Now, I'll be honest with you, and I'm a graduate of North Dakota State University, and I love the place, but when I was looking at changing our calving dates, I went to the head of animal science at the time and said, give me all the research out there on later calving. I got like a half a page, and there just hadn't been much look at it. And I understand, again, we're traditional, but why didn't anybody look at that? And finally, I went and beat my head against the wall, because I lost 100 calves to scours one year, and my dad had passed away. My hired man that had been with me for a long, long time had passed away. My boys were still young and in school, and I said, I either got to change or I'm going to quit, because this isn't fun anymore. My quality of life had went to heck, and that's why I talk a lot about that now. And so I went over to the wall finally one day and beat my head against it and said, you've got to do something. And after I changed, I said, my God, why was that so hard? And that's why, because it gave us more opportunities. Now, if you're used to selling right off the cow, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. But for us, where we either run them on grass or sell them to go to grass, it really increased our profitability. And we didn't, sure, those calves are lighter, but they're green, and that there's a huge demand for that. So that part worked out really good. The cow size was a bit more of a learning curve, I suppose. You start out in this, and you find out, boy, some of these bigger, and you guys all understand this. You look at any curve of the cow size in the United States, and it's on a steady increase. And again, I won't criticize anybody for cow size, color, or anything else, but we had to get our cow size and type down that fit these grass systems. They're made for more inputs. Let's just be honest about it, and that's fine if you can make that work. And maybe you live right next to an ethanol plant, and you can get all kinds of cheap products there. That's great. In my case, it didn't work, and I had to bring those down. And we're still working at that. That perfect cow type is always a challenge. We've come a long way. but every once in a while there's an oddball in there. Now I'll tell you one of the weakest links in our system is trying to get the heifers bred up without inputs. And I've talked to guys that have been doing this longer than I have, and they're always like, you've got to be patient. You'll get there, keep selecting. I said, first off, at this age, I have no patience anymore. And I want it to, function right away. And we're getting there, but I just want to tell the folks out there, you run into these weak links, and Gene, you talked about weak links, and you just got to be prepared for them. Everything isn't just perfect.
Great question, Chad, and thanks, Jerry, for being honest through your whole presentation. Had a few questions chatted in here, and if you're still on the line and you have questions, send them on in. We may not get to everything tonight, but we're happy to have them, and we'll get back to you via email after this. We've got two different folks asking about, and Gary, this may be more for you to start with anyway, managing legumes, especially in those wetter climates, and balancing that with weed control. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it would. I wish there was an easier question to start with, because that's always a challenge. How do you manage those? And so a lot of times it's going to, depend on which weeds that you're talking about. Sometimes like for instance, if you take the standard kind of system where, you have cool season grasses, fescue, orchard grass, whatever, and you have a bunch of winter weeds, sometimes, what you can do is particularly if they're easier to control weeds, buttercup and plantains and some of those kind of things, a lot of times you can spray those in the fall, or the fall, early winter, kind of the November, December period, when you get a little bit of warm weather, spray and kill those. And then, like if you use 2,4-D on those, you have about a 30-day window after you spray 2,4-D where you can't plant anything. But then after 30 days, you can come back and you can plant clovers. And so if you spray in kind of the November, December period, you can still come back into the February period and frost seed, red and white clover on top of it. And so you can kill weeds in the fall, plant your clovers in the spring. So that's one way to deal with it. If you have some of the harder to control weeds where, it takes some of the herbicides that have a little bit more residual, things like, Grazing Next and those kind of herbicides, really what you've got to do is you need to really try to get your fertility in good shape to make your grass, your soil fertility, get it in good shape to make your grass as aggressive as possible. So you can do some out competing, and you may have to really concentrate on weed control one year, knowing you're going to wipe every bit of your clovers out, and then come back with clovers after the residual is gone. And maybe you can go 2 or 3 years with clovers, tolerate some weed pressure, and then after 2, 3, 4 years, you come back in, you have to hit it again, and you just kind of fit it into your rotation like that. 2 or 3 years with clovers, 1 year without, another 2 or 3 with, and kind of have that rotation.
Anybody else want to throw a thought in on that, or that was a good job, Gary, but don't want to cut any of our other presenters off if you have input.
Well, this Gene, I was just thinking that the animal behavior, there's a lot of animal behavior studies on those weeds. You may be able to put some money in that animal and force them into getting some positive feedback to graze the weeds, if that's possible. That's just another idea.
Yeah, I do know that works, and some weeds are more palatable if they're trained to eat them than others, right?
That's
right. Another question, I think this may be, well, I'm not sure who this is for, but question about reeds canary grass and maybe even in wetter areas. Would that be a good option, or does anyone on the panel have any experience with reeds canary grass?
Yeah, Josh, so this is Gary. I'll try to take that one. Yeah, so reed canary grass is one of the more flooding tolerant cool season grasses really that we have. So if you have an area that you can't get anything to survive and it floods out, then reed canary grass is one of your one of your options. The problem with it is that reed canary grass can have some alkaloids in it, so you need to get one of the low alkaloid varieties. But the other problem is my experience has been, if you have an area that is wet enough that you have to grow reed canary grass, it's probably also too wet for you to be able to either graze it or cut it for hay during the springtime. And so by the time you can get around to actually grazing the thing, it's usually pretty mature and relatively low quality. But that's what you can, that's what I think of reed canary grass being used for, is that wet natured ground grass. Another one that sometimes we can use in the kind of the mid-south and further south is one of the warm season native grasses, eastern gamma grass. It's one that's very tolerant of wet conditions. In fact, I've seen it growing on the bank of ponds, and so it'll tolerate real wet ground. But since it's growing during the summertime, a lot of times those wet natured soils, those areas that kind of flood, have dried up some, and so you can actually get in there and graze that and use that area for forage. So that's a couple of options.
Yeah, that sounds like great advice, Gary. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, this Gene, they have used, depending on the hydro period, on how dry that particular site will get, you can go ahead and use prescribed burning. That will invigorate the reed canary grass, and you got to put a lot of cows on it to keep it down, but that might be an option.
Good call. We've got a question here that actually may be for several of you, but Chad, you may want to weigh in on this one too. In more arid areas, getting farmers to invest in the seed to plant a cover crop when it's pretty hit or miss can be a challenge. So what advice would you have for producers in those areas, or those that are consulting them on how to judge that investment and potential success there?
Well, this is Jerry, and I get that question a lot. It's why we went to full season cover crops, and I don't know if the person asking the question, in a lot of places you can plant a cover crop after a crop, and you can do that in North Dakota sometimes, but it's hit and miss. A lot of times we're dry, and in our case, where we're trying to grow a lot of material so we can, hopefully not feed a bale of hay, we had to go to a full season cover crop to get enough material to make that work. I'm not opposed to planting after say a wheat crop or something that comes off relatively early and make that work, but we had to go so we have enough moisture, and he might be in a drier area than we are, but we're not all that doggone wet around here, and it works out really well. But and sometimes then people will follow up, well, that's land I had to take out of production, and I'm always like, well, what's the value of soil health? First off, we haven't quantified that very well, but we're getting better at it. And is that $1 an acre or 1,000? Well, it's probably closer to the high mark than the low mark. But in our case, if I can save $200 per acre or $200 per head in our cow operation, and then I'm building the soil health, which I can't quantify real well, and then we know we're also propagating all this wildlife, which, because we run a hunting outfitting business, that does generate income. But even if I wasn't doing that, it's a positive image for agriculture and the consumer side. So hopefully that helps them a little bit.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit more to Jerry. Even on Jerry's slide, he was, I think your example, I think you showed, Jerry, you were around $23 an acre or somewhere in there.
Right.
And that's kind of a good area that I try to keep at in sort of this more arid, is, around that $20, and you can get a good cover crop and to be able to graze. I think one of the things to add a little bit too of what Jerry said is that even if, say, worst case scenario, we don't produce enough forage that you're able to graze it a little bit, but there is a huge value, economic return on the kind of the long game. It's that next growing season, and some of those things of increasing that the biodiversity in that soil will have better water retention, of, like Jerry mentioned, of kind of building a better sponge. It'll pay off. And you got to look at it from an investment and a long-term investment from that. But most cases, if you keep around that $20 area and have a diverse mix, as Jerry mentioned in his presentation, it'll pay off for you from a grazing perspective, as also from a soil perspective.
All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. I know we've gone a little longer than we usually do, so we'll let everybody off the hook here. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you, Chad, for hosting tonight. And we'll look forward to seeing a lot of you back next week. And again, be sure and spread the word on the series and the recordings. And hopefully you're enjoying it. And thank you again to our presenters. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
very much.
All right. Thank y'all.
Have a good night.